This video is intended for AQA A-Level Psychology. Today I am going to run through the essentials of the very famous study by Solomon Asch of 1951. You need to know this for your social influence topic in paper 1. Within this presentation, I will outline all of the main sections of Asch's study, including a brief look at the variations he later tried out. I will cover a few evaluation points as well for those all-important AO3 marks. It's really useful to understand a little bit of historical context for this study. You may be able to think of a further evaluation point using your knowledge of this. Asch conducted this study in America within a time of great conformity. This was the post-Second World War era, which led directly into the Cold War against the USSR, mainly Russia. There was a lot of concern about possible communist sympathizers in American society, a lot of paranoia and secrecy, and a great fear of spies feeding information back to the USSR. Senator Joseph McCarthy led a series of investigations to try to root out communists. This time in history is known as McCarthyism as a result. Due to this, people who were in any way different could be accused of communism on very little evidence and subjected to heavy questioning, often resulting in losing their jobs and being ostracized in their social circles. Therefore, many people felt they should try not to stand out, and so it was a time of great conformity. Perhaps that's why Asch wanted to study it further. We need to consider his study within this context. Perhaps people were more conformist at this point in time, in this particular place, than in other time periods and other places. How valid are his results as a consequence of this? Here is an example of McCarthy's influence on ordinary Americans. He firmly believed there were hundreds of people working as spies for the Russians in America at the time. So, back to Asch's study. His aims were simply to find out to what extent social pressure from a majority group could cause a person to conform, even when they knew it was clearly the wrong answer. He was basically aiming to investigate a type of social influence called compliance. This is when a person feels pressured, either directly or implicitly, to go along with the group publicly, despite internally believing something really quite different. Here you can see some pictures from Asch's study. The true participant can be seen in the bottom picture, sitting on the right-hand side. He is second to last around the table. He certainly looks rather confused and worried in the top picture. Maybe this will get you thinking a little bit about the ethics of Asch's study. On to the procedure. Asch used a sample of 50 in his original study and then a sample of 123 American male students in his subsequent study. The Illuminate textbook refers to 123, and so that is the sample size I'm using here to avoid confusion. For a laboratory experiment, this is a fairly large sample size. You might like to start thinking, though, about some problems there may be with the sample. All American, all male, more on this later. The participants had been told that this was a study on vision. Of course, this wasn't true. This is an example of deception. Asch hid the real intention of his study from his participants to avoid the possibility of demand characteristics. This is when a participant changes their responses or behaviour due to their perceived knowledge of the aims of the experiment. Would you go along with the majority if you knew the experiment was testing conformity? No, probably not. So Asch made up a believable story about this being an experiment to investigate visual abilities. The task was to judge the length of a test line against 3 other lines. Participants had to say which of the other lines the test line was the same length as. The answer was always unambiguous, completely obvious, as you can see in these sample pictures. The catch was that there was only ever one true participant in the room. The other 7 people were actually actors. We call them confederates. They had been told beforehand what answer they had to give. The true participant believed everyone else was just like him, so once again they were deceived by Asch. The group sat in a semicircle and had to say out loud their answers. The true participant always sat second to last, so they heard most of the rest of the group's responses before they had to give their own. It must have been a very strange experience for the true participant. To try to avoid the true participant smelling a rat, the incorrect answers were only given on 12 of the 18 trials. Otherwise, it might have been a bit too obvious. Asch wondered whether the true participant would conform even when the correct answer was obvious. What do you think you would do? Would you be worried that everyone else was seeing something different from you? Would you feel under pressure, stressed, worried? Would you be thinking that perhaps you hadn't understood the task properly? Here are the results, and as you can see, they were rather conclusive. On average, the real participants conformed to the incorrect answers 36.6% of the time. That's just over a third of the time. I bet it was difficult to say something different the other 63% of the time. A quarter, 25%, of the participants never conformed. Hats off to them. Asch also carried out a control condition where participants completed the task alone, just to check that it was a very clear, unambiguous and obvious task. He found that less than 1% gave an incorrect answer. It was a very easy question. The graph gives you a better idea of just how much difference the presence of the group made to participants' answers. Here is social influence at work. To help him draw correct conclusions, Asch interviewed his participants after the experiment to find out why they had conformed. They confirmed his suspicion that they did know their answers were incorrect, but felt an enormous amount of pressure to go along with the group at least some of the time to try to fit in and avoid ridicule. Normative social influence was Asch's conclusion. Participants conformed in order to fit in with the social norm of the group. As mentioned previously, this is a clear example of compliance. The participants' outward public behaviour, the wrong answers, changed in order to fit in, but inside they knew these answers were wrong. How often have you found yourself saying things or nodding along in agreement, or maybe just not outwardly disagreeing in order to be accepted by a group? Maybe you felt a bit bad about it afterwards. Perhaps you can be a little kinder to yourself now that you can see that you are not the only one to feel such social pressure. This is a normal aspect of human behaviour, and as we can see from Asch's study, most of the time the participants did stay true to their beliefs. They conformed enough to avoid conflict or rejection. Asch wanted to find out more about the different variables which affect conformity, so he conducted further experiments in 1953 to test out a number of variations. He tried adjusting the size of a group. As you can see from the graph, what he found was rather interesting. As the group size increased, so did the level of conformity, quite sharply, but only up to a point, and then it levels off somewhat. Beyond the group of 3, a larger group made very little difference. He also tested out whether it mattered if the whole group was unanimous or all in agreement. What would happen if one confederate disagreed with the rest? This is called dissenting. He found that having a dissenter decreased conformity, but that it didn't matter whether or not they actually gave the right answer. The important thing was that they also disagreed with the others. This is what gave the true participant the confidence to also disagree and resist conformity. Finally, Asch tested the task difficulty. He wondered what would happen if it was actually quite difficult to work out which line was the same as the test line. Would conformity increase as the task got harder to figure out? Yes, that is exactly what happened. The harder the task, the greater the conformity. This fitted in well with previous studies by Sheriff, who had proposed another type of conformity which occurs due to informational social influence. This is when we conform not to fit in, but because we don't have enough information to know what the correct answer is, so we look to others to provide it. So, now what we need to do, as all good psychologists must do, is to criticise Asch's groundbreaking research. We have to consider the strengths and the weaknesses of his work so that we can evaluate its value as a piece of research. Is it valid? Is it reliable? Is it ethical? Is it useful? Does it apply to everyone, everywhere, in all social situations? To kick off, let's start with the weaknesses. I'm sure you'll have picked up on some of these already as they are blindingly obvious to us in the 21st century. Firstly, being put into a room with a bunch of strangers and being asked to judge a series of lines is not an everyday occurrence, thank goodness. These are not truly social groups like friendship groups or work colleagues. Judging line length is not something we commonly need to do. So therefore, it is a very artificial study, and we can say that it lacks ecological validity, as the findings cannot be generalised to other, more natural situations. They are very specific to this specific experimental scenario. Furthermore, there is obviously massive sample bias here. With an all-male sample, we can say Asch's study is gender biased. The assumption was that if men do it, everyone does it. How wrong does that sound? This minimises the possibility of gender differences between men and women, and so it is an example of a beta bias. In fact, some research suggests that women may be more conformist than men, but Asch wouldn't know this, as he didn't test women. Of course, this was again partly as his study was a product of his time. He likely used male students. There were few women studying at university at the time, and so not an available group for him to use. Plus, 1950s America was far less equal and more patriarchal than it is now. Think 1950s housewife, for example. The other issue with the sample is that all the men were from the USA, and yet Asch's conclusions implied that he had discovered universal responses to group pressure. Well, of course, unless we test other cultures, we don't know this is true. So Asch's study is also culturally biased, again with a beta bias, minimising differences between cultures. American culture, along with the rest of the Western world, is thought to be characterised by individualism. The individual is king. We are all very concerned with being unique and expressing our own personal identities. But this is not at all the attitude of many non-Western cultural groups, who may be characterised by collectivism. This is a concern with getting along peacefully and harmoniously with others, over and above any individual desires. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that conformity rates have been found to be higher in collectivist cultures. Overall, the issues with the sample suggest that Asch's findings cannot be generalised to everyone, only American men, and so we can say his study lacks population validity. Now for the good news. We must firstly remember that there is a reason you are learning about Asch's conformity study from 1951, some 70 plus years earlier. This study has been immensely influential in psychology. And although there are some differences in conformity levels for different groups, the basic concepts he identified, normative social influence and compliance, the impact of group size, unanimity and difficulty, have been upheld by other studies. For example, Lucas, 2006, applied the study to solving maths problems. The more difficult the problem, the greater the conformity. This backs up Asch's findings into task difficulty, aiding its credibility, and also shows how his ideas can be applied to a more practical setting. However, Lucas was able to add further knowledge as he discovered that individual differences impacted the level of conformity. Those who were less confident in their math skills were more likely to conform. This is a very good example of how the scientific method works, where one researcher tests, confirms, and builds on the findings of their predecessor. Okay, enough talking from me. Now you need to check that you have retained this information. Can you answer these questions? You should be able to. If you can't, watch this over again and have another go. As an extension activity, you could go through the acronym for evaluating studies, GRAVE, to see if you can come up with further evaluation points for Asch. I have already hinted at a few through this presentation. Remember, GRAVE stands for Generalizability, Reliability, Applications, Validity, and Ethics. I hope you found this presentation useful.